Hi, I'm Izzy, and this is Dizzy Quilts and Sews. In today's video, we are going to piece and quilt block number 2 in our Quilt As You Go sampler quilt along. All right, so here is what block 2 looks like. So this is called the rolling squares block, and it is made up of a few different building blocks, if you will. So we've got flying geese over here, so we've got 4 of those. We've got square in a square over here and over here, so 4 of those. Then we've got these blue rectangles and 1 background square in the middle. So as you can see, we're going to need 2 different colored fabrics plus our 1 background. And what I'm going to use, so my background is the gray fabric. My flying geese and square in a square fabric is going to be this beautiful blue. And then the rectangles around the middle is going to be this floral here. All right, so as far as cutting, here's what you're going to need. And again, I'm going to put all of the quantities down in the description below. So for our flying geese, we're going to need 1 5 1/4 inch square and of our colored fabric, so in my case this blue here, plus 4 2 7/8 squares of our background fabric. So that's for our flying geese. Then we're going to need 4 2.5 by 4.5 rectangles of color number 2, and this is going to be our dark blue rectangles here. We're then going to need 16 2.5 inch squares of our background, and that's to go around our square in a square blocks here. And then we're going to need 1 4.5 square of our background fabric for the middle. All right, so again, refer to the description box below to cut all of your pieces. I'm not going to show you how I cut these because again, I've got a video on the channel that explains to you how to prep and cut all of your fabric, and I will link to it down below if you need a refresher. And then I'm going to come back to you once all of my pieces are cut. All right, so here we go. I've got all of my pieces cut. So I've got my background, my color number 1, which is what I'm going to use for my flying geese, and my square in a square. And then I've got my darker blue, which I'm going to use for the rectangles. So make sure you've got all of your pieces ready to go, and you can put them on the side for now because we are going to start with the flying geese. And for the flying geese, you're going to need your 5 1/4 inch square of your color number 1, and you're going to need your 4 2 7/8 squares of your background fabric. And we're going to start by putting 2 of those right sides together in 2 of the corners facing each other, basically. So I'm putting them in the 2 corners facing me like this. And I'm going to take a pen or a pencil. Where did I put that? Hold, please. All right, there we go. And you're going to mark a line from corner to corner. And you're basically marking your background squares here. There you go. So you're marking a line right there from corner to corner. And now what we're going to do is we're going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from the line on both sides. So similar to what we did in block number 1 for our half square triangles, So you're tracing the line, but you're not, this is not your stitching line. You're going to stitch a 1/4 inch to the right and a 1/4 inch to the left of your marked line. Again, I've got a 1/4 inch foot, so I don't need to make any other markings, but if you don't and you really want to be accurate, then you can use your ruler and mark 2 more lines, one on either side of the middle, and then those become your stitching lines. So I'm going to go and get those 2 lines of stitching done, and I will come right back. All right, here we go. So I have now sewn or put 2 lines of stitches, hopefully that comes through, 1 on each side. And now we're going to use our rotary cutter and ruler and cut down that marked line. So right in between those 2 stitching lines, and cut our piece in half that way. Now you're going to go to your pressing station and basically press those little ears up, making sure the seam allowance is also going up towards your little ears. So you're going to end up with 2 pieces that look like this, and the seam allowance should be going up towards those little triangles. So press that up and then come back here. All right, here we go. My 2 pieces are pressed, and now I'm going to take my remaining 2 7/8 squares and put them each on the blue part, basically, of my weird looking shape over here. So I'm putting my square right up in the corner, and again I'm going to use my ruler and my marking tool to mark a line right from corner to corner on my background square. And I'm going to do this for both pieces. There we go. There we go. And you're going to do the exact same thing. You're going to stitch on the right and the left of your marked line on both pieces. All right, so I've stitched on either side of my line, and now I'm going to cut on the line. And you're going to end up with 4 separate pieces. All right, 4 pieces that look like this, and you're going to go to your pressing station and press the triangle up, again making sure the seam allowance goes in the same direction, and that's going to give us 4 flying geese. All right, so go to your pressing station, press all of these as flat as you can get them. All right, here we go, my 4 flying geese. Now these should measure 2.5 by 4.5 if you've been pretty accurate. And I'm looking at mine, and yeah, they're pretty much there. What we're going to do now before we sew these into our blocks is to cut off what we call little dog ears. You can take your scissors for this. I'm just going to take my rotary cutter and just trim off these little dog ears from all of my flying geese. There we go. If your blocks aren't quite 2.5 by 4.5, so if they're like a hair smaller, that should be fine. You can just make sure that when you sew these to other parts of the block, your seam allowance is just like a hair smaller than 1/4 inch. If your block, however, is bigger than 4.5 by 2.5, take your small ruler and trim it down, or trim them down to 2.5 by 4.5. So there you go. Now we've got our flying geese ready to sew into our block. Next, we are going to make our square in a square block. So you're going to need for that your 4 4.5-inch squares that you've got in one of your colored fabric, and your 16 2.5-inch squares. And to make this block super, super easy, you are going to stitch one of these squares to every corner of your 4.5-inch square. Now, you put your square in one of the corners, take your pen or marking tool and mark a line from corner to corner of your background fabric, like this. So I've marked a line from corner to corner here, not from corner here to here. It's like right along this. You are going to sew right on that line, and you're going to do that for all 4 corners. However, you might think, oh, well, I'm just going to do this super quick, and I'm going to put all 4 of my squares, mark, and then just go to the sewing machine one at a time. However, you'll see when you put your square here that there's a bit of an overlap over here, and you don't want that overlap to happen before you flip your triangle over, if that makes any sense. What you could do to make things a little quicker is to put 2 squares in opposite corners. So put your 2 squares this way, mark your stitching line, and then go and sew those 2 lines. Press your triangle towards the outside like this, and then put your 2 other squares in the opposite corners. Do you know what I mean? So stitch your 2 lines, press your triangle away from the middle, and then go and do your other 2 squares. So no matter what you do, you're gonna have to go to the machine twice for each square. What you could do though is do these 2, and then take your next square and put 2 squares here, and do this for all 4. Go to the machine, stitch on all those lines, do your pressing, and then do a second round with the 2 opposing squares, opposing squares, I should say. So I'm gonna go and get that done and come back once all of my squares are sewn and pressed, and I'll show you what we do next. All right, so here are my small blocks all done and pressed. Now you have a decision to make at this point. We have extra fabric in here, right? We now have like 3 layers in each corner. You can take your scissors and trim the 2 layers that are underneath. You can do that. What I like to do, or you can basically leave it intact, that's going to be a lot of extra bulk in your seams, but that's fine too. What I like to do is trim off the middle layer only. That's because it's very, very hard to be 100% accurate when you're piecing these little things. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see, but you'll see that my triangle on top is not perfectly aligned with the blue layer underneath, which was basically the base layer. So when I go to piece this, if I removed both back layers, I'm going to be tempted to align the gray color to the next block I'm sewing it to, when really what I should align is the blue layer. I hope this all makes sense. So what I like to do is basically just remove the middle layer and leave everything else as is. The only time I don't do that is if the base fabric, in this case my blue, is a lot darker than my background fabric, because then you can get some shadowing. Now this blue is obviously darker, but I don't think there's a huge shadow being created there. So I'm just gonna grab scissors, and here's how I do this, quick and dirty, people. Grab my scissors. I've got my finger holding the blue layer out of the way. I've got my thumb holding my gray layer out of the way. And then I just take my scissors and chop off leaving about a 1/4 inch. And I'm going to do that for every single one of these corners. So hold on to the top and bottom layer and chop off the middle layer, leaving about a 1/4 inch. Doesn't need to be super exact here. You can eyeball it. And there you go. And I'm just going to go ahead and do that to all 4 of my, oh, and here's Bear. Hi, baby. And you can see, actually, now that I removed the middle layer, that the blue is poking a little bit on the side here. So when I go to sew this block to something else, I'm going to align the blue raw edge instead of the gray one, because that is really and truly what my 4.5 inch square is, if that makes sense. You can't see him, but Bear is right over here, just out of shot, lying down on top of all of my quilting fabric. So this quilt is gonna have quite a little bit of black hair sewn into it, I think. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and trim all of these blocks, and then it's gonna be time to put our block together. All right, there we go. So now we are ready to put our block together. We are going to start with our middle square. So this is our 4.5 background square. Next, we're going to put our rectangles all around our middle square, like this. Next are the flying geese, and you want the long colored side to be on the outside. So like this. And then finally, our beautiful square in a square. And there we go. Look how pretty that is. Very, very happy. All right, now's the time to start sewing it all together. And we're gonna do this by starting with our flying geese and rectangles. So you are going to piece your plain rectangle or your colored rectangle here at the bottom of your flying goose or flying geese blocks at a 1/4 seam allowance, or 1/4 inch seam allowance. And in this case, it's probably going to be easier to press the seam allowance towards your darker fabric or towards your rectangle. So do that for all 4. Now remember, you're piecing your rectangle to the pointy end of your flying geese. And it's going to be really important, if you don't want to chop off your point here, to sew from this side. And you want your stitching line to go right at the junction of your stitching right there. And that'll make sure that your point over here is basically uncut. All right, so go and do that for your 4 flying geese, and then we're going to start putting our rows together. All right, here we go. So all pressed and ready to go, and see how the point in my flying geese square is not cut off at all. It is intact and whole. So that's what you want to try to achieve. I mean, again, nobody's going to look at your points and make sure they haven't been chopped off, so don't lose sleep over it. All right, so now we are ready to start sewing our rows together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my first block, put it on top of my second, and put that on top of the third. Take that to my machine, this little pile, and sew everything together. Press my seams and bring it back onto my table, and then move on to the next row. So I'm going to do that to all 3 rows. Again, try and make sure you have a consistent 1/4 inch seam, and try not to chop off your points here. Just try it. You don't have to. All right, and I'll be back when I've done that. All right, so I've sewn my 3 rows and pressed the seams. So what I've done is I pressed the seams in opposite directions. What that means is I'm now going to be able to nest them when I sew my rows together. For the top and bottom rows, I've pressed my seams towards the middle. That was where they wanted to go anyway, so I just pressed them towards the middle. And for the middle row, I've pressed them away from the middle. And what that's going to do is when I go to sew row 2 to row 3, I'm going to have nicely nested seams like this. And I can just put a pin right at the intersection of the 2 seams. And that's going to make for nice, crisp corners. So go ahead and do that. So pin at the, I call them the major intersections. So basically where your seams intersect or should meet, put a pin in there. Now stitch at a 1/4 inch until you get to the pin and stitch right up to it. Take your pin out, continue to the next pin, stitch right up to it, take it out, and then stitch to the end. And do that to assemble your entire block. And there you go. My block is all pieced. I'm gonna try and get rid of some of the fluff everywhere. But now we're at the point where we're gonna go and quilt it. Oh my goodness. So make sure you cut all of your stray threads. And if you've got any cat hair on top of that, try and get rid of that too. All right, now you're gonna take your 14-inch square of batting and your 14-inch square of backing fabric and make your little quilt sandwich, and we are gonna go over to the sewing machine and quilt this baby. All right, so I'm at the sewing machine and we are now going to quilt our block. Just gonna move my ruler aside. And the design we're gonna do on this one is a grid of straight lines on the diagonal on the block. So basically our first line of stitching is going to be from one corner to the other, and then we're going to stitch about one inch from that line all the way to the outside, and then do it in the other direction, which is going to give us a very nice grid on the diagonal. Now I've got my walking foot on my machine. If you have one, I suggest you put it on. And I've got some gray thread, which is pretty neutral and is going to blend in nicely on my background fabric and is just going to give me a nice texture all over this block. Now, you need some kind of tool to mark your lines. I am going to use my Hera marker. Hopefully you can see that. There it is. And my long ruler. And what this Hera marker does is basically it allows you to crease your fabric where you want to stitch. There we go. So apply some pressure to make sure you get a nice crease, and you can easily see it. And you can see it on the camera right here. So you can use a disappearing ink pen, you can use masking tape even. If you have masking tape that's about 1 inch wide, you can use that. You would simply lay the tape right corner to corner and then stitch right next to your tape, then take it off and reposition it right next to that stitching line, and that will give you about a 1 inch spacing. I really like using masking tape, but I could not for the life of me find my roll today. So I'm going to use my Hera marker and my ruler, but a roll of masking tape works really, really well. All right, so you're going to obviously put your block under the needle, put your foot down, and at the very beginning of the line, like we did for block 1, you're going to turn your stitching length all the way down and then stitch a few times. There we go, just to anchor everything in. And then you're going to turn your stitch length to about a 3. And then slowly, this is a walking foot, not a running foot. Slowly stitch from one corner to the other. And then when you get close to the end, turn your stitch length down again and cut your thread. And there we go, first line of stitching all done. Now I'm going to use my hair marker and mark my second line about 1 inch away from my first one. There we go. All right. And now, because I started my first line of stitching at the top here, I'm going to turn my block and start at the other end, just so my block doesn't get distorted or I don't have too many drag lines. Again, put my foot down, a few short stitches, and then stitch my line. Now, I'm not putting any pressure on my quilt top here. I'm just guiding it. But I'm also gently pulling to make sure everything stays flat, because you'll notice I didn't baste this. I didn't use any pins. I'm not using any spray starch. I'm not using any thread. This is, you know, my 3 layers are loose. So I'm making sure I'm holding it down, but I'm not putting pressure on it, and I'm just gently making sure my fabric where I'm stitching is staying nice and flat. There we go, second line all done. So now I'm going to mark my third line and keep going until that whole half of my block is quilted. And then I'll do the exact same thing for the other half. And then I'll show you the rest of it. All right, and there we go. All of my little block is now quilted one way. Now we are going to do the exact same thing, but now I'm going to mark the opposite way, so from the other 2 corners. I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to try to have 90-degree angles all along, which means I'll have nice little squares the whole way through. But again, nobody's going to notice if your squares aren't exactly square. Now, the one thing to be careful of, because you've already stitched all across your quilt top, when you go to stitch this line, it's going to want to push the fabric up against this stitching line, and now there's no more give to your fabric because it's stitched down this way. So go slow. Again, with your hands, try to flatten the fabric as much as you can so that you don't get any puckers or anything getting caught. So I'm going to start again with a very short stitch length and then go up to a 3. And I'm going to go slow. And I'm gently pulling on the fabric so that it stays nice and flat. There we go. Looks really nice, and there's absolutely no puckers at all on the front side or on the back side. Not that you're going to be able to see anything with this fabric. But basically the goal is no puckers and everything stays as flat as possible. So we're going to do the other direction exactly the same way we did the first. So I'm going to mark 1 inch apart, turning my little block with each stitching line to eliminate any kind of drag marks or drag lines on the fabric. And then I'll come back when I'm all done. And there we go, all done. Look at that amazing texture on here. Isn't that great? All right, so now just like for block number 1, you can, if you want to, baste or stay stitch almost like the perimeter of your block at about 1/8 of an inch, just to make sure that everything stays put, because these blocks are going to sit for a while. But there's really no need to square up or trim anything at this point. So you are done with your block number 2. And there you go, block number 2, all done, pieced, quilted, and looking fabulous. So 2 down, 7 to go. As always, if you have questions about anything in the video, please don't be shy. Put them in the comments box below or send me an email. My email address is always in the description box. I do my very best to answer all questions within 12 hours-ish. So don't be shy. Just put your questions in there or send them to me by email. Thank you so much for watching the video and participating in this quilt along. If you like the video, please give it a like on your way out and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of these videos in the future. Thanks again, and I will see you soon.